Future Now Show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
Welcome to the Future Now Show, the show where we dive deep into the future of our world, exploring how we, in a globalized society and economy, can adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing landscape. I'm your host, Katie, aka Miss Metaverse. In this episode, we're exploring the critical opinions of Bronwyn Williams, a renowned futurist known for her insightful perspectives on global trends and future scenarios, issues we confront daily, and how they'll progress into the future. Bronwyn's expertise in forecasting the twists and turns of our socioeconomic pathways makes her the perfect guide for today's discussion, which promises to be both enlightening and thought-provoking. We'll be covering a wide range of topics, from economic predictions in a post-pandemic world to the role of emerging technologies in shaping our future economies. We'll delve into the challenges our society faces and the innovative solutions that might emerge. We're also going to look at the future of work, digital currencies, and the impact of government policies on fostering innovation and ensuring equitable growth. So sit back, relax, and join us as we journey into these fascinating topics with Bronwyn Williams, here on the Future Now Show, where the future is not just a destination, but a path that starts here and now. Hi, Bronwyn, welcome to the show.
Hello, sorry for interrupting you there. I'm always eager to get onto these things.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, great to have you on. Let's kick off with the questions. So, how do you foresee the global economy evolving in the next 10 years, especially post-pandemic?
Yeah, so my general overview of the economy at large, that'll be the global economy, is that it is very much a post-normal economy at the moment. It is very strange where we are headed. There are no rules, because a lot of those rules we kind of make up as we go along, quite infamously when it looks at sort of central banks. But I've been terming this a sort of nonsense economics era. It's almost like absurdist economic policy that we're seeing. And I think that my favorite sort of signal that sort of points to that is how in China, in order to appease investors who have been investing in this so-called property boom, analysts are now estimating that they've built enough now sitting vacant housing, in other words, surplus housing supply. So in other words, you get people to invest in this property market, but there's no one really buying it, and the population isn't really growing. And there's enough surplus housing now to basically house a third of the world's population. That's extraordinary. That's nonsense economics at large, right? So the question for when we start looking ahead 10, 20 years into the future, that's how much of a Pollyanna optimist are you? How far do you think we can kick this clearly unsustainable can down the road? And of course, this touches on not just economic sustainability, but environmental sustainability too. Clearly, at some point, something has got to give. We can kind of see this as a global game of musical chairs, where when the music stops playing, in other words, when people stop believing in the surrealist nonsense economy that we have, it's driven by debt and all these and false projections of growth, who's going to be left without a seat? So we can speculate, and of course we shouldn't really do that as futurists. We can have different scenarios, we can think about what can go wrong. The point is somebody's going to be left without a chair. The question is it going to be the global south again, who have been the global losers from nonsense economics in the past? And this is not the first time humanity has had such strange ego and optimism and greed-driven cycles before. The question is who's going to be left without that chair? Is it global south? Is it China itself? Have they overinflated? Have they got perhaps not quite rich enough before they've got old? Or is it the West's turn to take a bit of pain? And now those are the sorts of questions that we can discuss and we can certainly speculate, but we shouldn't actually try and make firm predictions on, because there's of course a lot of other levers at play. When we look at the economy, we have to understand that when it comes to the economy, there's kind of two layers. There's the real economy and there's the nominal economy. Or if you're an economist, there's a sort of goods services market, and then there's the monetary market. The goods market has hard rules. There's only so much stuff in the ground. And yes, we as futurists, we can talk about going and mining asteroids in the future, but there's still kind of hard limits there in terms of energy expended in order to get those resources and services. We're talking about the labor market to the people who actually need it. Money market, however, is not subject to any of those rules because it's a made-up market. It's made up based on sort of human behavior, human systems, and human norms. It's basically just a rule book that we've kind of agreed to, and not necessarily everyone agrees to at all times. And unfortunately, that rule book can change who gets to own what like I was saying, sort of musical chairs kind of economy, but it can't make more chairs, the monetary markets that we see. So generally, most of the sort of unfairness in our economy, if we look at inequality, international inequality, it comes from people who are rigging the rule book on the nominal, the money, the made up side of the market, instead of accounting things in their own favor. And when it comes to that monetary side of the market, if we want to start looking at predictions as to who's going to be left without a chair in the sort of 10 or 20 years ahead that we kind of see these cycles kind of collapsing, well, we need to see who's got the power to get other people to believe in their made up rules. And therefore, we have to look very, very quickly, as we always do in futures, because everything is connected, to who holds real power once again. And real power, unfortunately, in our world, we're talking about the power, or at least the credible threat, to use or abuse violence in order to impose your rules upon the global order. And again, when we look at the global economy, it is global, it is connected, it is basically borderless. Decisions that are taken in one part of the world have real effects in other parts of the world where citizens are not voting for those policies. So it really is a totally global interconnected system. It's very exciting to bet on these things and to see who's going to win and who's going to lose. The only thing that I can say with certainty is that the nonsense will not hold. Sooner or later, people will lose faith in the clearly crazy numbers that we've been kind of deluded into believing when it comes to things like growth, again, very nominal sorts of looking growth. And the question is then where the fallout is going to be. And I'd love to hear what anyone's sort of thoughts are on who those losers are going to be. My hint would be to sort of follow the power. Unfortunately, in this world, the powerful sort of take what they want and the weak kind of suffer what they must. This has been the human story so far.
What role will emerging technologies play in shaping future economies?
Yes, I think this is quite an interesting question. I don't necessarily think that emerging technologies shape our economies so much as technologies accelerate underlying trends and patterns. And of course, the technologies everybody's talking about at the moment, if you want to look at futurists and pop futurists and people that like to sort of be known as thought leaders across the LinkedIn or speaking stages and all the rest of it, everyone's talking about things like AI and Web3. And I think that those are very interesting in that, very much like COVID, incidentally, these are technologies that amplify and accelerate those underlying trends and, most importantly, inequalities in our societies. These are technologies that lead to an increase in Matthew effects. In other words, winners take all, losers sort of got to fall. Very ABBA, if you want to sort of see the sort of effects that these technologies have, because they do accelerate. If you are good at something, they can make you very much better very quickly, and you can monetize it thanks to the Web3 components that we're sort of talking about there that we see emerging. And at the same time, if you're starting at a disadvantage, it's very hard to catch up. That's the sad thing about inequality, and it's a particularly sad thing about inequality in a world where you are having sort of exponential technology underpinning those social trends that we see. So my key thing that I would say there, that the technologies that we're seeing at the moment are likely to increase inequalities and entrench, more on a more sort of social perspective, entrench the as to now implicit or unpriced also inequalities we have in our societies. And here I'm talking about things like status, the things that underpin the value, as until now, the sort of more extrinsic rather than intrinsic kind of value that we have as human beings. And this is what we see very clearly taking place when we look at the Web3 side of things. Again, accelerating the differences between the winners and the losers, is that Web3 allows you to convert your social status or your as to now unpriced value in society and to then price it quite explicitly. And we see this all over the place. We see all sorts of things that weren't priced before now being able to be priced, whether it's through micropayments, whether it's through trading your body on platforms like OnlyFans, whether it's through trading your farts like some influencers have done by converting them into NFTs. It's just incredible that you can take status and now converts it into cold, hard cash. Again, all this does is that it increases those sort of inequalities that underpin so much of what goes on in society. If we kind of see society in the ways that we drive each other, an evolution of our planets, of our species, really all sorts of creatures in the world, you kind of got these two parts of competition and collaboration. And the competition side is quite obviously always trying to make sure that you are slightly higher on the crab bucket to someone else. And when it comes to money, it's quite easy to try and see where you fit in. Like Elon Musk is richer than me, therefore he is higher up the ladder or higher up the pyramid than I am. When it comes to sort of social status, up until now, it could be more variable, right? You might value status based on someone's intellect, the books they've read, the degrees they've collected. Someone else might value someone's status based on how famous they are, how many followers they have, how many movies they've got, how many Oscars they've got. And what's so interesting about sort of Web3 technologies at the moment is how we're able to price all of those things and turn them all into money markets. So we're able to much better kind of analyze where we belong on the social pyramid, for better or for worse. And I think one of the first ways that normal people have seen this is actually in dating markets. There's been so much research that's been put out about the strange economics of dating markets and the huge Pareto effects there, because dating markets really do that. They take all of your social profile, your economic status, your social status, and they kind of then give you a position and a score in the social hierarchy. And you can quite easily tell whether you are an alpha male or female, or whether you are, like most of us are by definition, more sort of mid-pack. And again, how those Pareto effects play out, where we start to see like the top fractions of a percent of men getting vast swaths of the sort of the woman in not just the 99th percentile, but all the way down to sort of the 50th percentile, just due to sort of selection effects. So anyway, that's a bit aside, but that just is quite a good example, I think, to get the sort of points across that I'm putting there when it comes to how probably technologies are opening up or illuminating the inequalities in our society and asking us to confront them. And we see this in political discourse too, how so many younger generations are more interested in ideas that are more socialist, more communist, and less capitalist for these reasons. They kind of sense the unfairness in our society, not necessarily because capitalism is the enemy, but perhaps because how we are pricing and valuing things is so unfair and entrenched, particularly when technology gets involved. So I hope I've kind of answered your question and haven't opened up too many new questions in its place.
Well, that helps me segue into the next one. What policies should governments consider to foster innovation while ensuring equitable growth?
Yeah, this is a really hard question, because I think what most countries at this point in time need to determine for themselves is what route to power they really want to excel at. Because as I said, this is kind of a winner takes all economy, not just on the nuclear scale, not just on the individual scale, but also on the international scale. You really want to be the best at something. And as my good friend and AI, really, futurist and technologist Dan Faggella speaks about, there's essentially two routes to power when it comes to technology, and that is either through backing innovation or through backing regulation, or if you have more power, trying to back both of those. Do you want to have control of the accelerator or of the brake? But you really do want to have control of at least one of those levers of power, because they're really the only levers of power that counts when it comes to sort of technological power gains. I think it's quite interesting if we start to layer on nuclear or individual optimism from population groups and surveys when it comes to the future of technology, with the responses of the governments in those countries. It's quite easy to kind of see which countries are aiming for more regulation, which ones are aiming for more innovation. We look at those surveys, say in the US, where we find most people are quite pessimistic about technology and things like accelerationism, for example. And in Europe, of course, we know Europe is very skeptical of technology and very quick to regulate. And at the same time, you've got people in Asia who are much more optimistic when it comes to technology, and a lot of their governments are kind of not necessarily putting as much weight on regulation as they are on innovation.
Do you see a trend towards more globalization or localization in the future?
There, I'd have to say a bit of both. Again, as I was saying, the economy is global. You can't really extract it at this point in time. So I think the global economy becomes more globalized. At the same time, politics is fragmenting. We've got to look at what people do, not necessarily what they say. So we're going to see more stated separatism, localism, homeland economics, and homeland politics, but at the same time, a more globally connected economy or real world.
What are the biggest challenges our society faces in the near future, and what solutions might we see emerging?
I think that probably one of the biggest challenges we see in our society is disconnection or atomization of society. When I'm talking about disconnection, I'm talking about physical disconnection and of course ideological disconnection too. But this idea of us becoming sort of individual islands, the idea that no man is an island is kind of being challenged. And I think that that idea of not having any sort of common ground to fall back on is hugely dangerous for the human race at this point in time when there's so many global borderless issues at stake.
Now, how might cultural values and norms shift in response to technological and economic changes?
Well, I think we're already kind of seeing this. And I think one of the trends that I've been looking at is the evolution of new religions, for example, and new belief systems, which often come about when we feel powerless, when we feel disconnected, and we feel like a loss of meaning. And I think the technology can both create those new religious ideas and then also challenge some of the ones that we have. But I think that that's probably a lens that I would look at that question through.
Right on. Now, what changes do you predict in the workforce, and how should individuals and businesses prepare?
When I looking at the future of the workforce, I think that the immediate sort of, but also long-term trend that we have to get our heads around is the problem of bullshit jobs. Of course, the late great economist David Graeber came up with that phrase. And bullshit jobs are essentially jobs that even the person doing them knows doesn't necessarily have to exist. It's not like a job that adds value, but it is still a job that pays you a salary. It's almost like performative capitalism, for example. You show up, you get paid, but you know that what you're doing is not actually adding value to society or even to your company. So we can see this in sort of bureaucratization of organizations and states too, where you have more managers than doers in a sort of organization. You also have a whole lot of nonsense jobs, like people whose job it is to write content for LinkedIn, for example. These are not fulfilling roles. These are just sort of placeholder roles. It's like the idea of having to write a sort of 5,000 word essay to get people to look at your blog post, you know, when you're a recipe blogger, for example. This is nonsense work, but it's work that we kind of have to do in order to play the capitalist game. And when we look at sort of the future of work and when it collides with technology, we see things like generative AI as, like most technologies, just AI is kind of on our mind at the moment, but the same thing could have been said about Microsoft Excel or even about the typewriter when it came out. This idea that technology creates a whole lot more surplus jobs at the same time that it destroys a whole lot of previous, often more meaningful, but also sometimes surplus jobs. This idea that AI is going to both create and destroy new and old classes, respectively, of bullshit jobs is again going to get us into a bit of a musical chairs situation, right? Where some people that were essentially kind of freeloading off the economy, working in roles where they were quite well paid, I kind of referred to that as the Zoom class, the inessential Zoom class during COVID, right? The people who sat at home in their pajamas and got richer at the same time as essential workers were risking their lives and got poorer, right? I mean, this was the grand irony of like the COVID period in time. There, the bullshit job holders kind of won. But when technology collides with what's going on, the first thing technology does is it looks for ways to reduce costs. In other words, to get rid of those classes of essentially non-value adding workers and replace them with technology. But at the same time, it creates a new class of bureaucrats to manage that technology, right? So it creates a new and often bigger class of essentially parasitic roles that extract value from our economy rather than adding to it. Again, this sort of falls in with my thesis of technology as an accelerator of inequality. And again, this new sort of class of bureaucratic, technological, parasitic roles. This is, of course, not a criticism of the people who actually end up getting these jobs. We all kind of have to play this game if we live in this global economy, are going to win quite a lot at the expense of much poorer people who work just as hard, maybe more hard in other parts of the world, right? So is it fair that somebody who's currently working as a content writer, of course, not a hugely life-affirming role, that now is being replaced by AI, is it fair that they lose their job at the same time that a prompt engineer is now getting R1 million salary from someone, right? Like no one really needs a prompt engineer. It's just something that's kind of fashionable for companies to have. It's a sort of twee example. But anyway, when you look at the future of work, we see a lot of wastage. We see a lot of sort of zombie economic sort of metrics coming through there too. But we're also going to see, of course, as I said, we've got the sort of musical chairs situation in this great sort of card game where we've sort of kicked the can of debt down the road. Sooner or later, that tide's also going to wash out. And basically, we're going to have to figure out where the real value lies. So I'm quite optimistic that that is going to happen, that a lot of the waste and the high valuations and the huge inequality in our society will come out with the tide. I hope, however, that unlike most revolutions that we can kind of see coming ahead, that perhaps we have some alternatives in place to prevent essentially the same order just rebuilding itself, which is what unfortunately usually happens with revolutions, like the likes of the Arab Spring. If you don't have a solid alternative to the old world, you look behind you and you find the revolution has kind of rolled around and you sort of back where you were before. So I think that that's kind of my perspective on the world of work. There's a lot of waste, there's a lot of surplus. I mean, I've written quite a lot about those sorts of things. And I think that smart and savvy organizations will be looking to focus on real value and real roles that are life affirming for the people that are doing them, and also value creating rather than parasitic to society. At the same time, there's going to be a whole new class of parasites and management consultants and technologists that are going to sort of grow up around the sort of technology that we see around us at the moment. But that doesn't count as sort of underlying subtext trend that I'm seeing or relating to here. And that idea that workers are looking for meaning, and the people that are in bullshit jobs, no matter how well paid they are not particularly happy. It's a very nihilistic, very absurdist place to live in. And it's certainly not a life-affirming, meaningful, joyful way to exist in the world. And we've seen a little bit of that now. We're going to see more of that sort of questioning why I'm participating in this sort of pantomime of capitalism that doesn't make sense. We see this with young people, with like Generation Z, the sort of trade analysts and people who look at generational theory talk about it. And this idea that they've kind of seen behind the curtain. They know that all jobs are dumb, right? If we put on these little costumes, we get dressed up, we put on little heels, we put on our makeup, and we go to sort of answer the phone or click some buttons on Excel, we know it's absurdist. We've all read the Dilbert cartoons. We understand that we're just sort of playing a role in a society and an economy that doesn't really make sense, but we do it in order to maintain our lifestyle. And once you've kind of looked behind the curtain and seen the Wizard of Oz standing there with his pants down, right? You just can't take it quite as seriously anymore. I'm also quite optimistic that these younger generations who have seen this and who are very cynically participating in the world of work, doing things like minimum effort Mondays, might actually be the sort of straw that breaks the back, that when we all stop pretending, we can start to actually do things that are real, are meaningful, and matter. So meaning and matter in the world of work, and sort of bullshit jobs as a sort of crack or wedge that's going to sort of break that open is, I think, an interesting sort of midterm future of work trend to talk and walk around.
How do you foresee digital currencies and blockchain technology impacting global finance?
Well, this again is something that I have written and spoken about quite extensively in the past, but in essence, what it comes down to is that very much you have to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that as useful and exciting, and as much as I love the philosophy behind private digital currencies, of course, everyone knows about Bitcoin and all the rest of it by now. The fact of the matter is, when it comes to ownership, when it comes to wealth, when it comes to actually applying rights rather than having rights in theory, where those are rights of ownership, rights of possession, rights of freedom of movement, freedom of speech, they can only be applied in the real world. And the real world is governed, as I said right at the beginning of this conversation, by the strongest. Now, in a democratic society, we sort of have social contracts whereby we give up some of our freedoms, both physical and physical, in exchange for having physical security from the state, whether that be through social security safety nets or through law and order. Now, when those things sort of break down, when the government doesn't supply what they have promised in exchange for what they take away, people start looking for extra state alternatives. So private cities, private security, private school, private electricity, like we were speaking about prior to this conversation here in South Africa, and private money are kind of symptoms of a failed social contract. But at the same time, those private solutions still have a challenge in that, how do you actually enforce them? You might be able to claim that you own an NFT or claim that your Bitcoin is immutably yours, but it's only yours in theory, not in practice, when it comes to actually trying to buy or own something, right? So if you buy a house with your Bitcoin, but it's not registered on the government housing register, you can still be evicted by your local police, right? I mean, like, it's the power sort of talks there. So currency that isn't legitimized by a state, as long as you are living within a state, is kind of a red herring when it comes to challenging power, right? So that's why when I look at the future of digital currencies, I think that the practical, pragmatic, not necessarily what I want, but certainly the next step ahead is the rise of central bank digital currencies, something I've been talking about since 2015, but suddenly it got popular around about towards the last quarter of last year. And of course, all governments across the world are kind of looking at these things at the moment, from mine in South Africa right through to Europe and Britain, trying to hire central bank digital currency sort of ministers or consultants at the moment. It's happening. And this is basically the digitization of currency. A lot of people think we've already digitized currency with the likes of credit cards. Yes, that was a step. But what's different now with central bank digital currencies is how we're tying together identity with the economy. And this is essentially legitimizing digital currencies in the eyes of the monopolists of force, which are currently the governments that control almost all territory on planet Earth, falls under the force, the military force of some power somewhere, even down in the Antarctic, right? I mean, the whole planet is basically being divvied up, aside from sort of small patches of the likes of the Sudan, where things are running under anarchy. So when it comes to things like digital currency, digitization of identity, in other words, is sort of a little bit more removing of our anonymity, a little bit more removing of our privacy, but a little bit more hopefully getting towards a more fair and transparent kind of economy is a direction that we are going in. But what digital currencies are going to do is, when we look at it through the sort of Web3 lens, where, as I like to summarize what Web3 is, it's essentially the world where all data is credit data, and it's a sort of commoditization of the digital commons. And those are very sort of grandiose sort of words to say. But what we are doing is we are tying the real world, our real rights, our physical bodies via biometrics through to our digital identities, and therefore giving them legitimacy in the eyes of the monopolists of force, in other words, in the eyes of our state. So it is basically a tying of, again, a lot of the things I was speaking about at the beginning, how our social status is now becoming sort of fungible into cash. The same way, and now our social reputation can be tied to our digital identity and tied to our currency and how that works. And there's all sorts of interesting things we can do with programmable money around that, and tying rights, responsibilities, fines, and privileges to these sorts of things. But basically, this whole idea that all data is credit data, and all credit is essentially, it's not just capital or debt. Credit is access to goods, services, and opportunities. So in other words, digital currency becomes your passport to basically everything. Your passport, your physical passport to cross through border posts using facial recognition, your rights to get certain prices, to go to certain places, to do certain things, or not, all sort of comes down tied to that. So currency evolves from being something that is merely capital to becoming something that is a proxy of your entire social credit. I'm not sure I'm making too much sense there, but basically it's this idea of digital identity becoming digital currency. And that's sort of closing the loop there between your offline and online identity. And therefore, also when it comes to private currencies, the likes of Bitcoin, they will only essentially be legitimized when they are linked to your real state-sanctioned identity, when it comes to using that potential cash or the potential credit that is private capital in the real world. The only way that that breaks apart is if the likes of like Balaji, who talk about things like the networked state, actually get physical control over physical territory. Only then do private currencies actually have private currency in the new world. In other words, you and whose army is really a question you've always got to ask when it comes to any question with regards to digital identity or digital currency.
One final question. Oh, sorry, continue.
No, go on.
All right, one final question. What advice would you give to investors looking to future-proof their portfolios?
I love this question. This is something I talk about all the time, and it's come up in both the books that I've put together. And in essence, if you are an investor, there are two things that you can do if you want to look at investing for a futures lens. You can look at, I'm sure many of you have heard of the futures code, right? Which starts with what is probable into what is possible and then what is preferable. So if you are an investor, you can choose to invest in the preferable future that you want or in the probable future that you foresee as likely to happen. Now, of course, as I always like to say to all investors, whatever you invest in, you're likely to get more of, right? So if you're going to sort of hedge against dystopia, well, you're probably going to get more dystopia. But if you're going to invest in the things that you like and you want, well, those things become more likely to materialize simply because you've backed your capital and attention behind them. Right. So there's kind of sort of two portfolios you can look to build. You can look to build your preferred portfolio, in other words, to back sort of fringe technologies that are doing exciting things that you want to see more of, whether that be space mining, space tourism, whether that be new antibiotic resistance sort of research to look for new antibiotic strains to solve antibiotic resistance, whether that be investing in things like private currencies in the hope that someone does come up and buy some land and buy an actual piece of territory that you can live in as a sovereign individual. It's a more optimistic sort of portfolio strategy you can look at. You can look at any of the trends I've spoken about that sort of excite you and go out and build a portfolio to back what you want. And then hopefully you'll get investment return, but hopefully you also get a real return in that you'll get to live in the world that you want to live in. The other thing to do is to invest in the probable future. In other words, think about the trends that I've spoken about today that you might not like, but you do kind of agree are probable, that that's kind of the way the world's going to play out. You might look at the likes of those empty properties in China and think, well, who's going to be carrying the can on that one? And you can invest according to what is likely. And that's sort of what I call the dystopia portfolio. And there, of course, the sort of Andreessen Horowitz of the world is a great example there. They're backing all sorts of technologies that could be absolutely awful in the real world, but are very likely to make you also an awful lot of money. So brain chips might terrify you, but if you think, yeah, we're going to do that, so well, then, buy into companies that are making brain chips. Surveillance, another one. I'm not a huge fan of surveillance. I don't want anyone to know anything. I'm a big fan of secrets. I've written extensively about that. At the same time, as an investor, I would be backing anybody who is destroying anonymity and destroying the privacy of the common and even the internal space. So I'd be backing anyone who's looking at into how to read minds, people that are backing facial recognition technology, people that are backing any sort of surveillance companies, whether that be biometric surveillance, whether that be insurance companies that are tracking your car, whether that be companies like we have in South Africa that put up get private communities to install their own surveillance cameras for security purposes in the neighborhoods. By all means, go ahead and buy into that, because that's a likely, probable, if not a preferable future to look at. So if I'm an investor, I'm always thinking, what is my lemonade portfolio? In other words, how do I at least get rich as the world is going to shit kind of portfolio? And what is the peaches portfolio? It might not be as likely, but it is something that I want to do my bits to back becoming more likely in the real world in the future. So I hope that kind of answers your question, but basically you can invest along any of the things that I've spoken about. There are many startups and many existing companies that will benefit from pretty much everything that we've spoken about today.
All right, so where can we find out more about your work?
Well, most of my work is on my company website. I am a partner at a company called Flux Trends. In other words, the world in flux, fluxtrends.com. And yeah, we do basically consulting so people understand how the world is so they can change it to how they want to be, right? You have to understand the world if you are going to change it. And that's basically the work that we do.
All right. Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to having you again on in the future.
Thank you.
As we wrap up, I'd like to thank Bronwyn for her valuable insights about the future. Her knowledge has highlighted important challenges and opportunities and encouraged us to think about our impact on the future. Thank you to our listeners for being a part of this exploration into our society and economy. We hope this episode has piqued your interest and given you new perspectives to understand our changing world. Remember, the future is shaped by our actions and choices. Let's approach it with positivity and readiness for new experiences. Join us for our next episode of the Future Now Show, where we'll discuss more topics about our world and future. Please subscribe, share, and give us your feedback. We appreciate your thoughts and look forward to your company in our next journey into the unknown. Until next time, keep being curious, exploring, and playing your part in the shaping of our world. Goodbye, and let's remember that we all have the power to create our future.